Hello world, and welcome to this edition of Tech on Fire with Blaze. I'm Blaze Stewart, architect of Monolith, and today we're going to be talking about app migrations and looking at how you start that with a discovery. So today we're going to be talking about doing assessments and how you can analyze applications before you move them into Azure. But I first want to do a review of the process to see how this fits into the entire scope of doing an Azure migration. So last week we talked about doing learning and getting ready to move into Azure. Now, learning about Azure has a lot of topics, and we discussed that in our first video in this series. And it's basically just increasing your baseline knowledge of Azure so that you can do an assessment and yet you can be informed whenever you go to move applications into Azure. The second part is what we're going to be talking about today, and that is doing an assessment. And this is where we're going to be looking at breaking down applications. What are the questions that we need to ask, and how do we get an application ready to move into Azure, and how can we obtain the kinds of pieces of information that make an assessment happen. Now, the third part of this is going to be creating a plan to move into Azure. And so once your assessment is done, then you take what you learned from your assessment and you create a plan. And then that plan will then be executed in the final stage, which is where you go through the process of actually taking an application and or workload and moving that into Azure, but you predicate that with establishing security and governance and an Azure landing zone. And of course, with everything else, we want to make this iterative so that we can rinse and repeat this process as we move new applications into Azure, or if we change applications that are already on Azure. So today we're going to be looking primarily at doing an assessment, and that's where we're going to be looking at the details that go into making an assessment happen, how that happens, and what it is that we're trying to accomplish with an assessment. If you were to boil an assessment down into its most basic components, it would look something like this. First, you have your discovery phase. And the discovery phase is where you go into whatever workload or application or applications that you want to move into Azure, and you look at how things are. What do they look like in their current state? What are the components that compose those? What are the processes that surround those? What is everything about that application or that workload that is interesting, that is going to impact my migration into Azure? Then you take that knowledge and you deduce from what you learn about Azure as to how things ought to be. And by how things ought to be, we're talking about how they ought to be in Azure. And also sometimes this is also a good time to make some modest improvements on applications if that's within the scope of your migration. So you do a discovery, how things are, and then you make a recommendation of how things ought to be in an assessment. And then this is going to precede the planning phase, is what we're going to get to in future videos. But there's a lot of details in discovery and there's a lot of details in recommendation, but most of the work that you do in an assessment is actually in the discovery and less in the recommendations, but we'll get to both of those at a later date. But so today we're primarily going to be focusing on the various aspects of discovery, which is going to get down into the weeds on several of the domains that we talked about last week in our video on learning, but I'm going to be talking through those today as how we can go through discovering various aspects of an application and then talk about the questions you need to ask so that you can gather information to make informed recommendations to create a plan to move into Azure. So the first thing I want to talk about is business process discovery. Now, I've started off with this because in my mind, this is probably the most important thing that we're going to talk about, because ultimately this is going to answer the why question for doing a lot of the things that you do in Azure. Because the business process is the entire reason why applications exist in the first place. So that's really the value that is being delivered by the application. So a lot of folks want to jump right into the technical details and start thinking about moving things into Azure, creating virtual machines, databases, and those kind of things. And those are important details. But the business process that underscores that is going to have huge implications on how that's done, what resources you select, how you set up planning, and a lot of other things that go into that particular process of moving into Azure. Also, many times there's a bunch of processes associated with supporting an application on an existing environment, and those processes aren't necessarily technical. So you have to really get in the weeds and look at the processes that are going to be changed by moving into Azure. So you have to do this business process discovery as part of your planning as you move into a new environment. So business process discovery, or really more fundamentally business discovery, is basically going to be looking at those various things. And these are some of the questions that you might want to ask. The first one that I like to ask anytime that there's a migration to Azure is business value. What are the principal drivers behind the application of workload that you're wanting to move into Azure? And what is this application doing? What value does it deliver? What is it trying to accomplish, and what service does it provide? These are the kinds of value questions that we're asking for. And another question is, what KPIs do I use to measure that value? Now, the KPI is basically just a way of tracking the success of a given value that is being delivered by the application. Say it is a video streaming service, and the value is that it delivers videos to a consumer. And I measure that based on how many views a particular video has, or maybe it's the number of hours watched on a particular streaming platform. And those kinds of KPIs would be indicative of the value that is being delivered by that. So I can quantify that and watch that number go up or down, and the higher it goes means that it's delivering more value. And so what we want to be able to ensure is that we are able to meet or exceed those kind of KPIs in a migration into Azure, or do it more efficiently, or do it at a lower cost, whatever it might be. Another thing to look at is culture. Now, culture is important because culture, as it relates to business process, is going to be centered around typically some kind of business process culture, which is basically something like Agile, or whether you're using some kind of lean methodology. Maybe it's more ad hoc, and then there's not a formal process. But the culture is going to be important because culture is going to establish a lot of the things related to governance and managing workloads on Azure as well. So we want to be able to encourage a DevOps culture ultimately for Azure, because everything in the context of Azure can ultimately be reducible to code. And that code is going to be infrastructure as code, application code, and scripts, automation, all those things that we can do inside of code. And so we need a culture that adopts that mentality and pursues that mentality for the purpose of being able to automate things and be able to produce an environment that is easy to maintain and scalable and maintain and secure, among other many things. And the DevOps culture that surrounds that is how people collaborate and how people talk to one another, communicate, and interact with one another as teams work together to accomplish that. So that last question is, how do teams work together, is going to be important, because that's going to have implications in how you set up environments, how rules are set up, how you control access into Azure, and a lot of things around that. Now, we also ask questions around process. And typically, if you're dealing with software, custom software, you might have a process for managing that. But as you move more and more into cloud, things like process become very important, especially if you adopt a mentality that is going to define everything as a pipeline that is going to be defined by automation or code. And that's not just merely for applications. It can also be applied to virtual machines, VPNs, any environment that you might have. You want to be able to define that as code so that you can quickly deploy that or move it or create test environments and those kinds of things, such as that. And this is an important question to ask so that you can say, what is the process I'm using? Is it Scrum? Is it Kanban? Is it Waterfall? Regardless of whichever one you use, it's important to recognize that process and understand it holistically, and then understand how cloud is going to impact that as you move into that. Another important thing is obviously going to be change management. Now, most people are familiar at least with change management from an IT shop, because it's a very well-established practice to have some kind of change management, because change is typically disruptive in an environment, and you want to be able to do assessments around that, analysis, talk about risks, understand how change is going to impact an environment, and then how you can mitigate against risk and do all of the preparation you need to execute a change and do it without disrupting business, and do it so that you don't expose environments, and do it so that you can continue to operate without mucking everything up. And then, of course, you're going to be looking at what tools are used to manage these processes. How do you monitor? How do you monitor environments? How do you monitor progress and tasks and things like that? And there's the question of not just the how you manage things, but what tooling do you use? Because ultimately, you're going to want to have to integrate anything that you do in the cloud into those same tools. Then, of course, there's automation tooling, which relates back to the process and change management. Which tool do you use to manage process is a big one. That's going to get around to what environments I'm using, like Jira. Am I using something like Jenkins for builds? Am I using something like Octopus for deployments? Or am I using something like Azure DevOps? You have all these various tools that you use to manage your processes. It's not just managing the actual automation, but it's also managing the tasks that associate with those, so that you can track work as it happens, so that you can manage changes, so that you can link all that together, so you can have a clear view into what's going on in your environment. So you might get around to builds, deployments, task management with boards, and then all the processes that go into making that happen. And lastly, there is what management tools are you using? BSM and ITSM tools. How are bugs and service tickets managed? Because these things are going to be reported back from your user base, so they need to be tracked, and they need to ultimately be translated into tasks and changes to an environment, so that you can ensure that you're addressing the needs of your customers. And then how are things done internally with updates and patch management? What is the process for managing that? Because all of these things are important to discuss whenever you start talking about moving to Azure, because ultimately, whenever you start moving into a new environment, a lot of this stuff is going to be shaken up and rethought through whenever you go into these environments, because you have to change not just the actual technical details, but a lot of the process that supports this is going to change as well. And so you want to ultimately get back to making sure that you're delivering that value, that business value, and that you're going to be able to do it better than you did before, or cheaper than you did before, to save on costs or things like that, so that you can ultimately do things in a more secure, more agile fashion than you did prior to moving to Azure. Because if you're just moving to Azure because it's cool and the guy down the hallway did it, then you're probably doing it from the wrong reasons. So this kind of analysis is very important, so that you understand the business implications that it will have for your applications and workloads on Azure. So the next thing that you want to talk about when you talk about an Azure migration assessment is to do a governance discovery. Now, this is a non-technical discovery too, and it's one that you have to consider up front when moving into Azure. Now, it's typically overlooked by smaller organizations because they tend to be more agile and not as focused on governance as, say, a large organization is. Large organizations typically deal with this a lot more because of the sheer number of people that they have working in an IT shop. They have to do this, and so they're going to be much more mature in that journey. So it's one of those questions that they just ask naturally whenever they start moving into a new environment. How am I going to manage my governance? Because they've already been through this process before. And this is something that you need to adopt regardless of the size of your organization, because done well in Azure, it can give you a lot of controls on Azure and a lot of visibility in what's going on inside of Azure. And it will also give you a lot of feedback from Azure, because governance as a rule is baked into the Azure platform. There's a lot of tools that you can take advantage of and leverage that give you governance controls and give you a secure environment that you need to know about. And then once you have a good idea of what those are, how do those map onto the governance processes that I have in play and the kind of rules that I have in play that I need to adopt in Azure and I've already adopted on premise or wherever my application might be. So the way that you do this is talk to key personnel and review artifacts. Some of the key personnel might be your chief information security officer or your CTO or CIO. And these folks are going to understand these governance requirements probably better than anybody, because they're going to be constantly being asked, how do I deal with whatever it is I'm dealing with? Maybe compliance or business constraints. Maybe it's the overarching security rules that apply to my organization. There's a lot of things that folks are going to be well aware of, and it's typically going to be done by somebody that is going to be at the top, that has a synoptic view of the entire organization. Now, you might have to ask pointed questions to folks that are going to be down and more in the weeds that are going to be able to answer specific details in some of these. But generally speaking, the high level conversations that you need to have with those key personnel and some of those artifact reviews are going to be the way to get these questions answered. So the first one is obviously, when it comes to governance, is going to be compliance. Are you in a regulated industry? And for many people, that's just the nature of their business. Maybe they're dealing with healthcare, and so they're going to be under HIPAA compliance, or maybe they're selling stuff using credit cards, so they're going to have to deal with PCI compliance. And there are tons of other ones out there. Some of these are going to be specific verticals. So maybe if you're working in law enforcement, maybe you have to deal with CJIS, or if you're in Europe, you have to deal with compliance issues for the EU, or maybe it's a specific to a given geography. But compliance is always going to be one of those things that you have to ask out of the gate. Am I in a regulated industry? So what compliance standards do I need to adopt, and what compliance standards do I need to enforce in my Azure environment when I go to define that, whatever it might be? Another one is business constraints. So business constraints, compliance deals with external factors imposing on a business. Business constraints might be internal constraints that are placed on an application or workload. And these are going to be more internally related. And it could be things like NDAs, non-disclosure agreements that you might have other organizations, or privacy policies that you've adopted internally. And these will have implications on how you manage your data in the cloud. So you have to be careful about how you store data, how you encrypt data, and so on. And these kinds of constraints are related to compliance, but they are more self-imposed rather than externally imposed to a organization. Another thing is talking about monitoring. How are apps and infrastructure currently monitored? And how am I currently looking at those? Because when you go to the cloud, monitoring typically changes, because in some cases you might not be dealing with your traditional kinds of stacks that you deal with. And infrastructure is monitored one way on premise, and it might be done a different way on Azure. And there's with the cloud, there's also new tools that you need to become aware of for monitoring the actual environment in the cloud itself. So you're going to be monitoring not just the resources that you deploy, but also the environment itself. Who's accessing what resources on Azure? Who is changing things on Azure? What are the login patterns for given users in Azure? All of these things are monitorable, and you have to take those into consideration whenever you start thinking about monitoring. And the monitoring strategy is typically going to be bigger than a single application, because you have to take in a lot more into account than a single application or a single workload. You have to take into account everything that I just mentioned and then some. Next thing is cost management. Because Azure is more of a on-demand model, you basically are renting instead of owning things. Cost management kind of shifts. Instead of doing a lot of capital expenditure for new equipment, you're doing operational expenditures for renting servers, for paying for usage patterns, for doing those kinds of things that are more consumption oriented versus things that are more capital investments into hardware. So you have to think about how it's going to impact costs whenever you move into Azure. And then you have to think about, how does that impact my billing? So in some organizations, you have things related to how are costs of an IT organization distributed across the organization. For instance, some organizations adopt a bill back model. So basically, a business unit in an organization will pay for the resources that they use, and the IT organization basically supports that. And so the IT organization will then do a bill back to that other unit based on the resources that they use, as well as the people. And so part of that bill is going to be your Azure spend. And so you need to understand how that is going to impact your billing models and your internal cost management solutions whenever you go to move into Azure. And then you have to think about what reports I'm going to need to derive that information. Regardless of however you track spending, you got to think about the reporting. And there are the kinds of reports that you need in order to do that. And there are ways to handle that in Azure, which gets down into how I tag resources, how I organize resources, etc. So very important to consider cost management whenever you go to Azure. And lastly, there is business continuity and disaster recovery. BCDR is important to any enterprise. And this is important when you go to Azure because it has impacts on how you manage your resources in Azure, how you set up disaster recovery, how you schedule your backups, how you build automation for disaster recovery, and all of these kinds of things come into play. And so you have to understand what is the BCDR plan for my applications and workloads on Azure so that I can implement those in a way that Azure will support and that will also deliver the business requirements for things like BCDR. So that would be your RPOs, which are your recovery point objectives, and your RTOs, your recovery time objectives. And having those numbers available is going to be very important on how you translate your BCDR plans into Azure resources and how you can set up failovers and automation and all that good stuff for building out that plan. So these are the kinds of topics that you're going to be looking for in governance discovery. So the third topic of conversation we do when we talk about assessments is security. Now this closely relates to governance, but governance in its scope is more oriented around strategy, and security is oriented more around operations. So governance is going to establish things like policy, and it's going to establish things like control. And then what security does is takes a lot of that policy and those controls and implements that and operationalizes that so that you have something that you can use to actually enforce what governance hands down as policy. So there's several things that we need to look at when we talk about security. And the first one is going to be very obvious, which is network security. When you go to the cloud, of course, you're going to have network exposure to applications and workloads, and you need to understand what those look like. So you're going to be talking about what kind of exposure does an application need. So am I going to be looking at exposure to the internet? Am I going to be looking at internal exposure? What ports do I need to open up? What kind of edge protection do I need? What kind of internal protection do I need? What kind of gates do I have between various layers in an application and these kinds of things? And what kind of connectivity is going to be for connecting back to on-premise resources? Does that need to be, is that a requirement? And if so, what does that requirement look like? And what kind of SLAs do I need to deliver on that? There's a lot of things that we go in to the network security conversation. And there's going to be an entire video that we're going to be talking about a lot of the network details. So we're going to be talking about establishing an Azure landing zone, and we're going to be talking about how to set that up. And a lot of that is going to be wrapped up in network security and how all that relates to one another. Another topic of conversation is identity management. So we're talking about identity management and access controls. Even if an application doesn't really have much of that, whenever you start putting things into Azure, you're going to have to deal with access controls because Azure itself uses Azure AD as a way to manage that. So inevitably, you're going to have to be able to integrate your identity and access management systems, whatever those might look like, with Azure. And you can do that a number of ways on Azure, and there's a lot of technical details in that, but you're going to be thinking about, am I just going to do a sync if I use Azure or if I use Microsoft Active Directory already, or am I going to be doing some kind of federation, or I'm going to be doing some kind of other scheme? And many of these are supported out of the box with Azure, just require some configuration. And then you would use Azure AD and the role built into Azure to manage our role-based access controls on Azure. But what you need to do in security discoveries is identify what is going to be managed. We're going to talk about policies like MFA and how does that relate to certain kinds of applications, because it might not be required for every application. And then what is the process for onboarding and retiring identities? In some cases, that might be already established, and it's just automatic if you just do something like a sync with an on-premise Active Directory, or it might be something that requires a little bit more thought to be put into whenever you start going into the cloud. Access controls stems from identity management. Access controls, again, is going to be not just related to the application, but you're going to be getting into things for Azure itself, who's going to have access to resources on Azure and managing those, database, application servers, environments. All of these things are access controls that we need to consider, not just at the application level, but also at the environment level, which is going to be something that you have to manage with Azure. So thinking about that is going to be a big part of any discovery process for applications. Data security is another big topic of conversation, especially in regulated industries, and what are the security requirements around that? What about the access controls around that? So we're going to be talking about, do I need to encrypt databases at rest? What about data in flight? How is that data exposed through APIs? And what are the access controls around that? And how do applications access data? Where is data being shifted around, and where is it being stored? And all of these requirements are going to be important whenever you start talking about deploying data into the cloud. And of course, monitoring, we talked about this in governance, but it also relates to security as well, because monitoring is a big part of security. You're going to be monitoring things on an environment, who's accessing it, when they're accessing it, what are they changing, but you're going to be monitoring your applications, and you're going to be monitoring your databases, you're going to be monitoring all of these networks and things that you have in play that you need to be reporting on and then also responding to. And so you might be standing up a security incident and enterprise management system, that's such as a SIM, and that would be connected to any kind of logging system, and you're going to be monitoring that through tools like that. And of course, you're going to need incident response management. So this is going to be your ITSM tools. How is security connected into that, and how are environments managed, and what systems exist to support these. And if they don't exist, how can I stand up those in the event that I need to? And how am I going to send out alerts? How am I going to get people up if I need to respond to an incident and manage that and control damage and do all those kinds of things that we might need to in the case of a security incident in an environment. Now that we've talked about business process, governance, and security, we can actually get down into our apps and infrastructure discovery. And this is going to be where you discover all the technical details of your application. So this is going to be more what the engineering folks are going to be doing whenever they start considering moving the application into Azure. And this is oftentimes what a lot of people just jump to this particular point in the game without doing the first three. And I would say do this one last so that you can actually focus in on getting the discovery done for the governance, security, and business process first, and then come to do this one at a later date, because those other ones are going to inform the upstream things that are going to be in play before you ever deploy your first application into Azure. But once you have those first three done, then you can go into the apps and infrastructure discovery phase of a assessment, and then you can look at the various things related to that. So there's a lot of things that we could talk about here, and this is going to be related to application architecture as well as some of the technical details as well. Application architecture is obviously going to be the way that an application is formed out in a more logical fashion. So we're not looking at a specific technology here. We just kind of understand the kind of the major pieces of an application from a non-technical perspective, maybe some technical details in that, but it's not important about what the scaling looks like or whatever the database technology is. It's just we understand, oh, there's a database here, there is a process here, there's another process over there. This process looks at this process or gets data from this other process and stores data in these various locations. We're looking at the application's purpose and its logical structure here. And so we want to understand what that application architecture looks like, because this is going to help us obviously map things on to resources in Azure whenever we go to deploy an application into Azure. So again, not getting into technical details, but just understanding the application components and how they relate to one another. Then this is where we can actually get down to the next one, is where we get down into the various components of an application, and we start to break it down, and we start to look at the more technical details and get a physical architecture of what things might look like. And this is where we're going to look at things like front ends, back ends, APIs, middleware, databases, integration services, and third-party services. All of those things are important. And so the application's purposes and logical architecture are more high-level, logical. This is going to kind of take that, break it down into the technical details, and then talk about all of the various things, front ends, back ends, APIs. We're going to talk about ports. We're going to be talking about the protocols, the technologies, the way that things are moved around, how are things stored, are they stored on files, are they stored in databases, what is the database technology that we're using, what versions of things are we using, what kind of integration services are we talking about messaging platforms such as a message bus, what messaging protocols are being used, and then external services. Am I getting data from external APIs? How is that data integrated into my application? Am I just bulk lifting that, or am I calling external APIs? And all of these things will have implications on how things move into Azure as well. Another important thing that's related to this, while these two are more looking at application architecture, whether it be application architecture or more of a software architecture, we also need to understand data flow as well, because these are just looking at the way it looks on a piece of paper and more of a synoptic view. But data flow is important because this actually shows how data moves through an application, from the time the data originates to the time that it's actually showing up in a report or into a final storage place. And understanding that flow is important because it gives us an idea of what the data architecture is going to look like. And sometimes that has implications in how things look like in Azure as well, because sometimes you need to understand what the data flow looks like, because sometimes you might have to do some refactoring of that, or moving things around and making sure that they're going to be optimized for Azure whenever you go for that. So these are going to be looking at application wise. Data flow is looking at more the data architecture and how things move through the system and so on, so that we understand that. Another thing to look at is the security models that are in play with an application. So security models are going to be important for understanding the technical details of how users access an application, what's the authentication and authorization story, how's it technically implemented, is it using a more traditional protocol like in TLM or LDAP, or is it going to be using something that's more modern, such as OAuth? Or some kind of HTTP-based protocol and that nature. How is that managed? What access controls systems are used? Is it internal to the application? Is it external to the application? What's data security look like? What's data encryption look like? And then, of course, compliance constraints on the application that have to be considered, such as a HIPAA or PCI compliance. And having those in play are going to be coming from governance as well as security. They're going to be talking about application and infrastructure discovery in the context of an application here. Another thing that's really important that is often overlooked whenever folks start to do apps and infrastructure discovery is availability requirements. And this is going to establish an SLA for an application, because SLA in the cloud and how you implement that is generally going to look a little different than the way you do that on premise. So when an SLA is typically defined by a percentage of time in a given period that an application is supposed to be up. So if I say in a given month, I want my application to be up 99.9% of the time, and we call that 3 nines, or is it 99.99% of the time, or 4 nines, or 5 nines? Each one of those has very different implications on how my application is going to be structured and deployed into the cloud. And then it's going to require me to think about what resources are available, how I'm going to manage that, etc. when I go to the cloud. So establishing an SLA for my application is going to be huge in how I deploy that in the cloud. Of course, disaster recovery, we've mentioned this already as a BCDR plan when we talk about governance, but also we get down in the weeds more right here at an application level. And so the BCDR plan for a given application needs to be talked about. And typically it's going to be on an application basis. So we're going to have higher priority applications and lower priority applications for our BCDR plans. And so we're going to be basing that on those priorities, and we're going to be establishing recovery point objectives, which are RPOs, which is a number, basically how much data can I tolerate losing. And that's typically measured in a span of time. So I can lose up to an hour of data. I can lose up to 5 minutes of data. Or something like that. And then a recovery time objective, which is basically how much downtime can I tolerate in the event of a disaster. I can tolerate 0 downtime, I can tolerate 5 minutes, I can tolerate 5 hours, I can tolerate 2 or 3 days. And those kinds of recovery time objectives basically determine how quickly I'm going to bring an application back up to an operational state. And of course, KPIs are important for applications as well. And this is going to be looking at how well an application performs. And this is oftentimes one of those things that folks don't typically look at. In addition to SLAs, many times you go into, in my experience, these are typically some of the most overlooked things in an application. Availability requirements are typically not established. It just says, well, it's up 24/7. Well, okay, that's ideal, but in many cases, it's not always reality, and you want to measure that and then be able to deliver an SLA so that you can hold yourself accountable to that, as well as KPIs. And KPIs and are important for determining how an application performs. And so some of these things can be like requests per second. How many requests per second can I manage? Or time to first byte is an important one for something like websites. How quickly is my site loading? How long does it take for a given request to operate? That is, how long does it take for a given request to go to a given endpoint, get data back, and return that back to a client? And these kinds of KPIs are going to be used to determine what my application should perform like and what I should expect it to perform like. And having tests to validate that or to invalidate that are going to be important so that we can tune our application once it's on Azure, and that we can use that as a way to also select the appropriate tiers for the application, or in the event that we need to improve on it, to maybe shift around the resources that I'm using to give me better performance for my application and make things run faster in the cloud. So establishing these numbers is going to be important for any app migration. I highly encourage anybody doing apps and infrastructure discovery to look at their SLA, find out what the RPOs are, discover what the RTAs are, and then discover what the performance KPIs are for that application. And all of those numbers will help us test environments and determine the best path forward whenever we go into the cloud and we start migrating applications that way. Fortunately, Microsoft provides some tools that help us out with the apps and infrastructure discovery, and we're going to be looking at these over a few videos. We're going to be looking at technical implementations of these just so that you can see how these tools work. We're going to be looking at the Azure Data Migration Assistant, which is a tool for doing assessments on SQL databases and helps migrate them in some cases. We're going to be looking at Azure Site Recovery, which is useful for virtual machines and physical machines. We're going to be looking at how that tool works and how you can use it to migrate workloads into Azure. And then we're going to be looking at another tool, which is the App Migration Assistant. What it evaluates .NET and PHP applications, and is specifically targeting Azure App Services, which is useful for platform as a service implementation. So we're going to be doing technical deep dives into each of these tools. So I'm going to mention them now, but we'll be doing a lot of more detailed look at each one of these tools and show you how to use them to do some of the apps and infrastructure discovery for your applications that you want to move into Azure. So the outcome of an assessment is basically an assessment report. Now, an assessment report is what you generate as the outcome of your process. So what you want to do is take your process of discovery and then you make the recommendations how you want things to look like on Azure. And we're going to be getting into the details of how you can develop a strategy for doing this. We're going to be looking at how to develop architectures around governance, security, business process, and applications and infrastructure. So we're going to be looking at these things in particular. We're going to be looking at how you can develop a plan for these and architecture for these in accordance to the well-architected framework for apps and infrastructure. We're going to make business process recommendations based on the way things are, and then we're going to be looking at things that exist in the cloud adoption framework as a way to inform that decision making. And then, of course, governance and security are one of those recommendations for everything that goes into defining your governance strategy, defining your security requirements on Azure for migration. And you'll be looking, of course, at the well-architected framework and the cloud adoption framework for those as well. So the assessment report is the outcome of this, but there's a lot of things that you do to go from the way things are, the discovery, into the way things ought to be on Azure, which is going to be the architectures and the recommendations that you define in this report. And we're going to be spending a few videos on how to develop a lot of that content and how to evaluate things and look at these various document repositories to figure out what I need to do in order to successfully migrate my applications into Azure. So this is the ultimate outcome, but we've got a lot of things to talk about before we get to those. And over the next few weeks, we're going to be looking at the various tools, and we're going to be doing technical demos of how you can use those to do app and infrastructure discovery and how you can do that to inform an assessment and then ultimately generate a plan to move things into Azure.
If you like this content, please consider visiting us online at www.wintellect.com, and there you can find about services that Wintellect offers, including training and consulting services. Also, please consider subscribing to this channel by clicking on the subscribe button and clicking the bell icon to get notifications when new content becomes available, and also comment down below. You can also follow me on Twitter at @TheOneMule, and also follow Wintellect on Twitter at WintellectNow or at Wintellect. We are constantly posting things about Azure-related technologies and things related to software development. You can also reach us by email at consulting@winelect.com. Until next time, thank you.